rest of the world. As a result, we're seldom mentioned in the news, but that's not to say nothing ever happens on Cape Cod. In 1903, the first wireless communication across the Atlantic occurred between Cape Cod and the King of England. In 1960, a local son, John Kennedy, was elected the 35th President of the United States.
It's not in sync with the
speech from the Armory in Hyannis.
Okay.
And then there was the summer of 1962. It was the height of the civil rights movement. 12 months earlier, Black and white activists known as Freedom Riders set out to integrate bus travel and challenge Jim Crow laws throughout the Southeast. A year later, in retaliation, Southern segregationists struck back with an imaginative and wantonly cruel counter-movement known as the Reverse Freedom Rides. Under this scheme, African Americans were offered one-way bus tickets to northern cities with the promise of free housing and guaranteed employment. Based on the opportunity of a better life, Black families boarded buses for Washington, D.C., New York City, and other northern towns. But the vast majority, of approximately 100, were sent to Hyannis in the hope of embarrassing President Kennedy and his family. Tonight, our speaker will recount the events of the summer of 1962 in Cape Cod and how these events reverberated around the nation. Before I introduce our speaker, however, I would like to acknowledge several people who supported the research for this presentation. Each of these individuals was invited to join us this evening, and I hope they are with us in this virtual meeting. The first is Mary Beth Bragg. Mary Beth is the daughter of the late Reverend Kenneth Warren, who in 1962 was the pastor of the Barnstable Unitarian Church and the chair of the Cape Cod Council of Churches Social Responsibility Committee. Reverend Warren worked tirelessly to organize the community on Cape Cod to help the Reverse Freedom Riders when they arrived. The second is Dolores DeLuz. In 1962, Dolores and her late husband were active members of the NAACP. They worked closely with Reverend Warren to secure housing, employment, and a new start for the Reverse Freedom Riders. John Reed. John is the current head of the Cape Cod chapter of the NAACP and the executive director of the Zion Union Heritage Museum. John has become the keeper of this story on Cape Cod. In fact, he was the person who first introduced me to this story in 2017. Ernie Dumas. Ernie was a young reporter for the Arkansas Gazette in 1962. He covered this story from the other end of the line, from Little Rock, Arkansas, as the Reverse Freedom Riders boarded buses to come to Hyannis and other destinations in the north. And finally, Raymond Arsenault. Ray is an American historian and academic. He was born in Hyannis, but lives in South Florida. Ray is the author of the definitive book on Freedom Riders, 1961, The Struggle for Racial Justice. This book is the basis of an Emmy Award-winning PBS program. And now, our speaker this evening is Gabrielle Emanuel. Gabrielle started her journalism career as a Kroc Fellow at NPR. She then went on to cover education for NPR before coming to WGBH in Boston. Since joining WGBH, Gabrielle has reported on everything from controversial real estate developments to sea turtles stranded by changing water temperatures. Gabrielle graduated from Dartmouth College and attended Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship. While at Oxford, she earned a DPhil or Doctor of Philosophy degree in comparative social policy. At the conclusion of Gabrielle's presentation, there will be an opportunity for question and answer. We ask that you type your questions into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Now, please join me in welcoming Gabrielle Emanuel to Tales of Cape Cod. Gabrielle?
Thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, so I want to start with a story. In the 1950s, there was a little girl named Betty Williams. She was growing up in a tiny town in Arkansas. She had a single mother and she was one of 11 children. And they lived in a little 3-room house with the kitchen was actually outdoors. And if you talk to them now, their recollections of their childhood were that they were incredibly poor. But they also had these moments of serenity in this tiny town in Arkansas. They remember fishing in the pond behind their house. They remember walking to their grandparents who lived just next door and had a beautiful flower garden. And needless to say, uh, Arkansas at this time in the 1950s was segregated. Betty Williams, this woman you're looking at, she says she didn't know a single person growing up who was white. But she said she also never questioned it. She never wondered why they didn't play together, why they didn't eat together, why they didn't do anything together. But her mother, it seems, did question it. Her mother, Leila Mae Williams, had heard about free rides to the north. And she was intrigued. She was promised that there were jobs in the north, jobs waiting for her. There was housing waiting for her. And as Jean referenced, there was President Kennedy. President Kennedy would be giving her a welcome if she took this free ride to the north. And President Kennedy was one of her idols. She had a picture of him on their living room wall alongside Martin Luther King. And she had this dilemma, basically. She had this life in Arkansas where she had family around, but life was really hard. And then she had this promised life where she had no community, no roots, no nothing, but there would be jobs, there would be housing, things would be easier. The president who she idolized would welcome her. And she debated what to do, it seems. And she decided to take these free rides. And she waited, though. She waited until the children, Betty being one of them, was out of school. School had finished for the year. But right after that, she accepted a free ride to Little Rock from their tiny town. And from Little Rock, they boarded a Greyhound bus. And eventually, that trip would take them to Hyannis. I want to play a little bit of archival tape that I found from the Historical Society in Rhode Island. And this is from an old reel. It's silent. And here you can see Leila Mae and her 9 youngest children. The 2 eldest, Betty being one of them, would follow later in that summer. So here is a bit of the tape. So what you see there is that they are all dressed up. They are excited. They're about to meet the President of the United States, and they're also about to have a better life. But of course, as Jean told you, they didn't meet the president. And this was all a scheme, basically. Oh, hold on, let's see. And so, I want to take a moment and kind of tell you what I want to talk about today. I want to go through the rest of the story, following the Williams, who are representative of this larger group of people who were part of the reverse freedom rides, and tell you exactly what happened, but with an emphasis on what happened in Hyannis, because as Jean mentioned, this was a hub of the events of that summer. Then I want to tell you a bit about the reporting process, kind of how we found the Williams, and just a little bit more about what went into telling this story. Then I want to tell you a little bit about how we decided to present it, because there were a lot of debates and a lot of choices we made in how to tell the story when we put it on the radio and online and on the podcast. And then finally, I want to talk about what we might be able to learn or how we could possibly think about what happened in the summer of 1962. So, as Jean said, the stage was set the summer before. And that summer, the summer before that footage was taken, the civil rights activists traveled across the South in an effort to integrate interstate transit. And those were the freedom rides. We've all heard about the freedom rides. They're basically written about in every history book of the US. It was this huge moment in the civil rights movement. But what happened the next moment, that happened the next year, is rarely written about. It's something that when this topic came up, I went to people who had covered race and ethnicity, civil rights, their whole careers, and they'd never heard about this. And that is what this group of white segregationists in the South decided to do to retaliate for the freedom rides, to get back at the North, to actually prove that the Northerners, the people who were traveling through the South, to point out their segregation and their racism, they themselves were racist, was the idea. So the reverse freedom rides was this idea concocted by a group called White Citizens Councils. These were local pods across the South, and they're often referred to shorthand as the KKK without the hoods, without the masks. It was kind of a sanitized version of the same idea. So professional people would join this. The rhetoric was softer, but the ideas were the same. And as I said, their whole motive in doing these reverse freedom rides was to prove that the North was being hypocritical by doing the freedom rides. And the scheme was to deposit African Americans in northern cities and then see how the Northerners react when these people showed up on their doorstep. And they expected the Northerners not to welcome them and the hypocrisy to be exposed. And what they started doing was the very beginning of the whole effort started in the South, and they set out to convince African Americans to take these trips north. And they did it through false promises, these promises that there were jobs up there waiting, there was plenty of housing, and they targeted exactly who they wanted to recruit. They wanted to recruit destitute families, single mothers who had lots of children, and also people who had just been released from prison. One of the ideas was that these people ostensibly would be a burden on society and thus ensuring the North would not want them. And also they would take the burden off the southern towns they were leaving from. And in several documents and audio recordings that I found, they acknowledge this motive. They say quite explicitly, and they laugh about it, and they kind of represent it as this huge success. But at the time when this was widely covered, it was huge news that summer, they offered a lot of different explanations for what was going on and why they were doing this, never kind of quite as explicitly in TV interviews. But I wanted to play for you some of the kind of explanations they offered. And this is a snippet from NPR's Code Switch podcast. So you'll hear me kind of introducing the different people, and one of the hosts, you'll hear her voice momentarily. And the clips you'll hear are, men who orchestrated the reverse freedom rides, men who were part of these white citizens councils. It grabbed headlines around the world. There were televised interviews, front page stories, all of it. And in the televised interviews, the segregationists offered lots of justifications for this scheme. Guthridge said it was a philanthropic effort.
We began this program in a spirit of beneficence and humanitarianism in an effort to help our Negro citizens.
Mm-hmm. Another segregationist, Ned Touchstone of Louisiana, said it was all social engineering.
To bring about a more equitable distribution of the colored population.
And then there's a guy, George Singelman of Louisiana. This was actually his original idea. He said it was a great American tradition.
Years ago, our forefathers put everything in their possession into covered wagons and went out across the plains
In those days, it was rugged Americanism. Now, today, for some reason or other, it's being frowned upon. I don't understand it.
So this was all happening in the summer and fall of 1962. And those Southern segregationists who you just heard didn't just send African Americans to any city in the North. As Jean mentioned, they targeted particular cities, and often they picked places that would be particularly salient politically. So say a politician had just said something about the North being welcoming, then these groups would send African Americans on buses to that city to try and prove their point. The North wasn't welcoming. And they did send people to New York, as Jean mentioned, and elsewhere, but they were particularly interested in sending them to small towns, places where this would make a splash, it would be news, it would make a point. And the largest number, again, as Jean said, went to Hyannis, almost 100. And they were sent there because the Kennedys were there in the summers. And Ted Kennedy, I will say, met the first reverse Freedom Rider. But as far as I can tell, I haven't found evidence that they met any of the other ones. There's a story that first one went after arriving on the bus to great fanfare. We actually have seen footage of it. There's, I don't know, hundreds of people there surrounding the bus trying to figure out what's going on. There are cameras, there are reporters. It was a big deal. And afterwards, Ted Kennedy went to a house and met with this reverse Freedom Rider. It was a single man. And one of the locals was trying to keep all the reporters out at the front door, and he came in the back door. But after that moment, it's pretty clear that the Kennedys didn't engage with the reverse Freedom Riders, as far as we can tell. And some have speculated that was not to draw attention to this scheme, not to kind of add fuel to what was happening. But so the Kennedys weren't there, but there were other people, and the town really came together, I think, at least a group of the town, to welcome these people. They formed, as Jean mentioned, a group that was in the local papers called the Refugee Relief Committee. And this was a group of religious leaders from the Unitarian Church in Barnstable, local members of the NAACP, some local politicians, and other townspeople. And it grabbed. Oh, and here you can see a story from the Boston Globe that reporting on this Refugee Relief Committee that was working really around the clock to try and help these families. And here is a passage that you can see from Reverend Kenneth Warren, who was really the chairperson of this committee. And he said this to a reporter at the time, basically why they considered them refugees, even though, of course, they were moving internally, but they were really seen as this tired, exhausted, afraid group that needed help. And Kenneth Warren, we have to thank him for a lot, not just what he did then, but he made my work much, much easier. And he kept incredibly meticulous notes of kind of who came, what they needed, where they came from. He kept his letters he received during the time, financial records of what they spent in trying to care for these people. So he did a huge amount of work. Another person who was there at the time working really tirelessly was Margaret Mosley, and she was tasked with meeting these families when they got off the bus. And she, in an interview shortly before she passed away, spoke about how she never knew when somebody would be arriving. So she kept a bus schedule with her at all times and would show up to meet every bus in case there was a reverse Freedom Rider who had just stepped off the bus, was, as they say, broke, tired, and afraid, and needed her to kind of help navigate what was going on. Because of course they were there expecting a presidential welcome. And instead she was there. And it wasn't just the welcoming moment. They then helped them kind of figure out where to go. Here you can see a list of people who arrived that was kept by this refugee relief committee. And this committee worked with the local community college and convinced them to open their dorms to the new arrivals. They convinced the local jail to provide bedding. Other townspeople contributed clothing and toys and food and tons of things. And then when the community college could no longer provide housing because summer semester was starting, they lobbied the governor actually to open Otis Air Force Base, open the barracks there to these families. And we actually found records of the rules Otis Air Force Base set out for these families, and they were incredibly strict. This was not a warm welcome, but it was from Otis Air Force Base, I should say, but it was a welcome. They were given a curfew. Boys who were over the age of 5 couldn't stay with their mothers. And Otis Air Force Base at the time, I think, was somewhat isolated. And for these families that didn't have a car, it was quite a challenge to be there. So this committee would drive back and forth, drive them to go shopping for food or whatever they needed. And Margaret Mosley remembers one of those drives, one of the little children who came with their mother saying, kind of, where are all the cotton fields? And when she said, oh, we don't have cotton fields here, this is a different climate, she recalls kind of the devastation that little boy felt. And he said to her, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to support my family if I can't pick cotton? So in her recollections, there was just a real devastation these families felt. And she was a civil rights activist her whole life. And she says that this was the most inhumane thing that she ever saw. She said that right before, a couple years before she passed away. But I want to say this wasn't just an outpouring from Hyannis. Actually, there was really a national outpouring. As we've referenced earlier, this was big news. It made headlines across the country and actually internationally too. And thus, the outpouring of support came not just from the town, but from far away. Here is one letter that, as you can see, Reverend Warren was sent at the time. And here's this person is offering to see if they can be of help. And they say, it says, particularly for the Williams family, the family we talked about at the beginning, they said, we have this house, a 9-room cottage that is available. Perhaps the family could take use of it. We'd be willing to help offer it and support them and host them. So it wasn't just offers like this of housing, but also money came in and words of support. And there were hundreds of letters like this. At the same time, there was hate mail, a lot of it, a lot of very, very racist hate mail. Here is one of the notes, and this doesn't even begin to capture the extreme of how far it went in terms of racism. At the end of the summer and into the fall, these families that had moved from the college campus to the Air Force bases, and then there were also some other residential situations. A couple families stepped up and really wanted to open their house, even though they didn't have enough room, or purchase a nearby spot that was run down but could offer shelter. In the end, most, not all, but most of the families dispersed. Many of them ended up going to Boston. And in the records, in the letters that Reverend Warren kept, there is evidence actually that the Boston branch of the NAACP and the Cape Cod branch of the NAACP debated what to do with these families, what would be most beneficial for them. And the Boston branch, the Cape Cod branch said, we should send them to Boston. There are more jobs there. We can't provide jobs for all these families here. But the Boston branch of the NAACP said, no, don't send them here. They'll get lost in the city. In a smaller town, they'll have the support of the community while they get settled. And there was this back and forth and debate of what to do. And some families chose to stay, but many, many left. And the Boston branch lost this battle. Many of the reverse freedom riders moved to the city, and that included the Williams family. And when I talked to them for this story, it was clear that life really hadn't been easy once they moved to Boston. They were far, far away from their extended family, and they were in public housing. And the younger kids of this family of 11 children who arrived, they really experienced the worst of the school busing in Boston. And here is Betty Williams, a very short audio clip of her talking about her mother, Lela Mae Williams, that woman who we saw who was beautifully dressed, getting on the bus with the excitement of meeting President Kennedy. Here she is. Here's Betty recalling what she was like when they were in Boston afterward. Hold on.
Tried with every ounce of strength that she had to try to hold this family together. She used to just cry. She used to just cry.
So, so that is kind of an overview of the story. And I wanted to now transition a bit to talk about the reporting. Now, I cannot talk about the reporting without starting by thanking and acknowledging all of the work that has been done on Cape Cod to preserve this history. I went to numerous experts who know the civil rights movement back and forth, and they had not heard about this. But when I went to Cape Cod, there were a series of places that had worked really hard to preserve this history. And that is the Tales of Cape Cod Community College, Zion Union Museum, and also the papers of Reverend Kenneth Warren were huge. It is hard to overstate in this reporting project what a benefit that was. But I felt like going into this reporting project that all the archival historical newspapers I looked at really told the story from the people who helped in the North and the segregationists in the South, what their motives were and what was going on. But it was very rare that I actually saw passages or any real coverage of the people who had actually been the reverse freedom riders. So I set out with the kind of goal of saying, if we are reporting on this, we have to hear from them. I didn't know if I'd be able to find a reverse freedom rider who was willing to talk and was willing to share this kind of incredibly personal part of their history. But what I ended up doing was I started by going through archival newspapers. My husband was a huge help on this, and we just laid them all out, and we highlighted every name of a reverse freedom rider that we could find, and then created a database on our computers of their names, ages, where they came from, whatever we could find. And actually, eventually, I connected with Jean and found that incredible list that we saw earlier of that Reverend Warren had kept, which is by far the most accurate. But in my the database I was creating before I connected with Jean, I connected these names with any public record I could find, their voting record, their marriage license, obituaries that might reference other family members. It was a growing database, but still I didn't know if I'd actually connect with these individuals, and I didn't want to tell this story without putting their perspective front and center, because in the previous reporting, obviously it was now 50 plus years ago, but it was their voice that had really been missing. So from this database, I then narrowed it down to a window where I said, we want someone who is young enough on these trips to still be alive, potentially, and old enough to actually remember it, because some of the people who were reverse freedom riders were 2, 3, 4 years old. So we narrowed it down, and then we set out, and some of these names were incredibly common names. So the family that I ended up really closely connecting with was the Williams. I didn't know how I would find the Williams family, but it ended up taking about 4 months of knocking on doors for addresses I found, cold calling, phone calls, and sending handwritten letters. And that ended up being the key. I didn't want typewritten letters. I didn't want emails. I sat down and wrote letters about why this story was fascinating to me and important and powerful, and why I wanted to know more about their perspective. And each one was individualized, and I sent out dozens of these. And I waited, and eventually I got a response from Betty Williams, the woman you saw here, this woman. And she responded, and I immediately knew she was a lovely, lovely person, but she wasn't sure whether she wanted to share her story. And it took another probably month and several visits where we looked over historical documents together for her to say, I want to do this. And I didn't want her to feel pressured. It was really important to me that she felt good about this and wanted to do it for her own reasons. And one of the challenges for Betty actually was that in the haze of this scheme and the lies and the kind of going up under pretenses that were misunderstood and mistaken, things had gotten, the story the family told had gotten, had become that the family were freedom riders, not reverse freedom riders. Betty remembers that anytime it came on TV, something about the freedom riders, they'd say, oh, we were part of that. We were part of that. And it was only kind of in our conversations that she began to kind of fully piece together all the different pieces that she knew, but hadn't realized the full context of. So she had to have time to process that history and to review all the documents and to really decide that she wanted to share it. And in the end, she did. And Betty and I still talk regularly all the time. I think she's very glad she ended up doing this, but it was not an immediate decision to revisit this very painful chapter in the family's history. So that was just a little bit about the reporting. But now is about, I wanted to talk about how we thought about presenting this story. So we'd done these months and months of work to piece together what had happened, and now we needed to find a way to present it both on the radio, online, and in podcast form. So what it ended up being was local radio story, a national radio story, national podcast, and online stories. And I wanted to share kind of two debates that I had with my GBH editor, Sean Corcoran, who worked very closely on this whole process. This whole story was his idea originally, and he was a huge partner throughout it. And also with the NPR team, we debated these topics. So first was one thing that we ended up not including. This was racist letters. Basically, when we were putting together the online story, we wanted to include at least a few of the thousands of documents we looked at in reporting. And in particular, we debated whether to include the hate mail that Reverend Warren received. We thought it could represent just how contentious, how debated, how heated this was, that the country was really divided at that time. And at the same time, we weren't sure if this was of the value outweighed kind of the pain. And in the end, we talked to people in the newsroom who report on race and ethnicity all the time. And it was in those conversations that we decided that we did not need to include the racist letters, that there was not value in providing a platform for it, and there was not real benefit in reading the racist words. So the second thing we really debated was whether or not to link the historical events and the divisiveness then to modern day politics. Now, the whole reporting project came about because in April 2019, President Trump suggested taking undocumented immigrants and dropping them off in so-called sanctuary cities. And that had triggered something in my editor, Sean Corcoran's memory about rumors of this reverse freedom rides. He had been a reporter on Cape Cod and had heard about this, but never done a little bit of digging, but never fully looked into it. And he asked me to look into it, triggered by this news event in April 2019. So the dilemma we faced was whether this history, the reverse freedom rides, should stand on its own, should be its independent history, not muddied or colored by all of the kind of tension in our current political debate. We didn't want to kind of color how people think about this historical event with all the feelings they have now. But at the same time, we really thought there might be some value in showing the echoes of the past in the present, that many of the issues that were relevant back then are relevant now. So in the end, we decided to include this link between the past and the present, although there were many, many hours of debating what to do. And we hoped to do it delicately by putting it at the end of all the other reporting, so people had a chance to think about the history independent of the present political situation. And also we had an expert who had independently brought up the parallels, do it rather than trying to kind of force this parallel ourselves. So I wanted to play that clip just so that you can also think about this dilemma that we struggled with and maybe come to a different conclusion. But here is a bit, and this is a clip from the local GBH version of the story. And first you'll hear a historian who we interviewed, one of the only historians to work on this topic. Actually, the only academic paper at all on this topic is from him. And then you'll hear both President Trump and also segregationist historical tape from 1962.
Historian Clive Webb of the University of Sussex in England says for him, some of today's politics are reminiscent of the reverse freedom rides.
In 1962, what was happening was the actions of a political fringe group. And in 2019, it's the federal government.
Mr. President, can you tell us your plans about sanctuary cities and illegal migrants that you tweeted about? Well, you know,
President Trump's idea of putting undocumented immigrants on buses and dropping them off in so-called sanctuary cities made Webb think back to segregationists like Amos Guthridge in 1962.
They want more people in their sanctuary cities. Well, we'll give them more people. We can give them a lot. We can give them an unlimited supply.
We're going to find out if people like Mr. Ted Kennedy and the Kennedys, all of them, really do have an interest in the Negro people, really do have a love for the Negro and a desire to help him.
And let's see if they're so happy. They say we have open arms. They're always saying they have open arms. Let's see if they have open arms.
While there's not evidence the Trump administration has enacted the policy, the president told a rally in Green Bay, Wisconsin, that he was implementing the plan.
I'm proud to tell you that was actually my sick idea, but sorry.
So Clive Webb, that historian we heard from, he goes on to say that actually the segregationists back then, historically, underestimated the human decency of others. So he looks at this parallel and says, actually, the takeaway is that the kind of the decency of people is what shines through of this historical event. And I just wanted to come to this last point of what we can learn from it. Now, of course, my job is simply to gather and report the facts, not to tell people what to think about the facts. So instead, I wanted to share with you of what, when I was doing my reporting, when I was interviewing people, what other people kind of took away from this story. And there were kind of pretty different takeaways. So I just wanted to offer those as a way, as you can think about how you're thinking about it and hear how other people viewed it. So first was kind of this Clive Webb perspective. And it was this emphasis on how the people of Hyannis and the people elsewhere really admirably came together and reacted to this prank, this scheme, and they gathered, they pooled their resources, and they helped these new arrivals. It's this story of people coming to each other's aid when someone's in need. So that was kind of one way to look at it, that the whole idea was to show the hypocrisy, but actually they weren't necessarily that hypocritical. Actually, they did welcome these people and try to help as much as they possibly could. And some people working literally around the clock to help these families find their footing in a totally new place. So that kind of uplifting story of how the town came together and was supportive is one way of looking at it. Now, I spoke to other people in my reporting who saw this really as a tragedy, really that the Williams family and others had been supported in the short term, but really hadn't been supported in the long term, that they had that summer and into the fall and winter, they had incredible support, but after that, they were really left on their own in a totally new place with no one to help them. And they felt the repercussions of that for years and years to come, arguably still now. And I know that at points, the Williams family debated back then whether they should return to the segregated Arkansas and whether life would be better there. So there is kind of that perspective that the ability of people to help in a crisis and the failure of humans to provide when suffering is long-term and sustained. So that was another perspective we saw. And then finally, the third perspective kind of shifts the focus from looking at what happened in the North to thinking about what happened in the South. And I referenced that the folks who kind of championed this scheme were white citizens council. And as I said, they were seen as this kind of sanitized KKK group. And this was their huge effort for them to kind of regain their standing and regain their stature in the South. And it failed. And this failed because as newspapers covered it across the country, average citizens, the public, stood up and said, hold on a second, this is not okay. And actually, across the South, there was a sense that this campaign was embarrassing, that this was shameful. And it was Southerners who really kind of put the end to this campaign. It was far less successful than they had trumpeted and hoped. They thought it was going to last for years, and it didn't. And the Southerners who raised their voices, there were places boycotting the towns and the states that were sending these reverse freedom riders on a national and on a local level. And in that frame, you could almost look at this story as these people I interviewed looked at this story as a blueprint almost of what to do when there's kind of a fringe segregationist group, how to combat them. And it was through this public pressure of a public taking a stance. So those were kind of the three ways that I saw when we're talking to people about the story, that they kind of interpreted and thought about the reverse freedom rides. Quickly, before we kind of open up and turn over to questions, I wanted to just acknowledge where a bunch of the material used here in this presentation came from. So here on the PowerPoint are a list, but that footage is from the Rhode Island Historical Society, and then photographs and information from the rest of them.
Ask why she thinks this isn't more, why so many people don't know about this.
June?
Gabriella?
Yeah.
Have any guess as to why this story is not better known across the nation or as part of the civil rights literature?
I don't. I asked that question to Clive Webb, who we heard from, who studied it, and his answer was that it's